Good evening. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about last lines in literature. And welcome back. Last week, I was talking about first lines in literature. Hi, Lisa. Great to see you. There's a book winging its way over across the Atlantic. I bet it hasn't reached the sea yet, but it will be flapping its way to you, which I'm really excited. And um, would love to hear how long it takes to get to you. So that's very exciting. And that was because Lisa recognised the first line last week from The Go Between. I'm sure other people out there will know that the first line goes, "The past is another country. They do things differently there." So tonight I'm going to be talking about last lines in literature. And I know that everyone's going to have very different opinions. It's not so much last lines actually as endings of books. Do you love a happy ending? Do you like everything to be tied up neatly with a bow, to know what's happened to all the characters, to even have a bit of an appendix in which we hear what happened to the characters 20 years later, which you kind of do get with The Go Between, because we know in that book that Leo is once again becoming a go between um, in the family that he was embroiled in back in his youth when he was only 12, and now he's 60, and we have his overview looking back on his life. So that is in a way a book where there is an overview looking back, but it's definitely not tied up with a bow and all very neatly explained, because we don't know what's going to happen when he delivers his final letter. Um, so I actually didn't bring The Go Between as one of my examples tonight, even though that ending is also a brilliant ending. So the question is, do you love tied up, neat, lovely endings that are all happy and in a way full of closure? Or are you someone who enjoys more of an enigmatic ending, which leaves you wondering what could happen next, which is obviously more true to life because we don't have our real endings tied up for us in our own lives? Or do you like an ending which has a sudden revelation? I must admit, some of those books with the sudden revelation are some of my favourites. Lisa, you're saying definitely enigmatic endings for you. Interesting. And I do love an enigmatic ending too. But sometimes, I must admit, I love a happy ending. Sometimes I just really want that happy ending where you know that the people get together at the end, the people that you've been falling in love with, they've been falling in love with each other, you want them to come together. Those cheesy endings can be joyous, and there's a few of those that I really love, such as The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnhem. That's one of my favourite books, and that does have a very happy ending, which I won't go into, but it's also unexpected because in that book the women who are the main protagonists go off leaving their husbands back in cold, horrible England. They go off to Italy to have an adventure. And you're imagining that they might end up going off with beautiful Italian men and starting a new life. But that's not what happens. And this is not going to be a book that I give you spoilers for. Just to warn you tonight, there will be spoilers on quite a few books that I'm talking about. So if you hate knowing what's going to happen at the end, this could not be the session for you. I'll tell you each time I'm about to reveal a spoiler so that you can choose to stay or not. So one of the first books that I want to discuss with you tonight that has one of the most interesting endings that I've ever read is The Life of Pi by Jan Martell, which I'm sure many of you will know from both the book and the film. It was written in 2000, would you believe it? It still seems incredibly fresh and not like a 20-year-old book at all. Um, and that is a book which has an incredibly interesting, ambiguous ending, one of the most ambiguous and unexpected endings ever. And for people that don't know the book, I'll just give you a little bit of a summary of the book. So the narrator, Piscine, who is known as Pi, grows up as the son of the manager of a zoo in Pondicherry, and while later recounting his life there, he proffers insight on the antagonism of zoos and expresses his thoughts on why animals react less negatively than proponents of the idea suggest. So it's actually a very philosophical book, as you can tell, even from that description of it, because the narrator has a lot of conflicts going on in his life, like being a vegetarian, working with animals, and eventually getting caught in a shipwreck when his family decide to leave India and go and live in Canada. And when they leave, there's a disaster strikes and everyone is thrown into the sea and most people drown. So the first bit of the book is set in India, and we see Pi being raised as a Hindu in Pondicherry. Then the second part of the novel is when Pi's family board the ship called the Simsum, a Japanese freighter that's transporting animals from their zoo to North America. So the zoo animals, crucially, are traveling in the boat as well. And some of the animals include the rather wonderful zebra, an orangutan named Orange Juice, and a giant Bengal tiger who's known as Richard Parker. And this is what gives the book its amazing fascination and drama, because Pi, when he falls off the boat and realizes that everyone around him is drowning, he manages to construct himself a small raft out of rescue flotation devices. And he believes that he's in a place of safety until he discovers that he's actually on board the boat with Richard Parker, the Bengal tiger, and OJ, the orangutan. And Pi, even though he's quite a young boy without enormous muscular ability, realizes that he's got to be the alpha male in this situation, because if he's not, then he is doomed to become meat and be eaten. Hi, lovely to see you, Colleen and Amelia and Anna. Great to have you joining me tonight. I'm talking about, at the moment, enigmatic endings. So I'm talking about different types of endings in books, and I'm starting with enigmatic endings, or endings which are not giving you the obvious answer when you don't know exactly what's true and what is not true. Isabel, great to see you too. By the way, anyone here, do let me know if you have favourite types of endings. John, great to see you. What's your favourite kind of ending of a book, I wonder? Do you love a happy ending? Do you like it all to be tied up and explained? Or do you enjoy the enigmatic ending, which is perhaps more true to life? Do you like your endings to be mysterious and left open? We all like them different. And I think we also like them differently at different stages of our lives. And I must say, there are times when I really want a nice, neat, happy ending. But The Life of Pi is a book which has two different endings. And that's what makes it so brilliant, interesting, and bizarre. Because Pi, to give you a bit of a spoiler, so anyone that hasn't read it, be prepared now for the spoilers, and sorry to do this to you, but you can always block your ears for this moment. Pi is stuck on this raft for 272 days with a tiger and an orangutan. Uh, the orangutan dies, and miraculously, the boy manages to successfully live on the boat with the tiger for a long time. And there's many dramas and adventures while he's on the raft. We see him go back in time, we see his philosophical ideas, And he also has a spell when he lives on a kind of carnivorous island, which is a rather terrifying moment for all concerned. And poor Pie is almost eaten by the plants on the island, and he sees in the trees that he's being cradled by, he sees teeth, human teeth, which are contained within the tree, and he realizes that if he stays on this island, he is going to be eaten. And the whole book is really about eating or being eaten. Anyway, Pi does survive, and he ends up in Mexico. And when he gets to Mexico and he's recuperating, sorry to cut a very long story short and to give the game away, and it's an absolutely brilliant read. Do read it again if you haven't read it for a long time. He gets interrogated by two Japanese reporters who are asking, how did you survive? What happened? How did you cross the ocean for 272 days in a raft with a tiger? And Pi tells the story to these two journalists of his life on board the boat with the tiger and how he survived. And it seems to them, of course, completely unbelievable. How could anyone survive, especially a boy who's just left his home, who's seen his parents drowning around him? How can anyone possibly survive such trauma? And they say, this can't be true. How could that have happened? And Pi says, okay, I'll give you the truth then. And he then, at the end of the book, tells them a different version of the truth, which is utterly shocking, in which he says that he was actually on the boat, on the raft, with his mum and a chef who both survived the shipwreck. And the chef is an absolutely evil, hideous man. And the chef, in his different version of the story, actually kills his mother and eats her. And it's deeply horrifying. And also, in this version of the story, Pi says that he then killed the chef himself and ate his liver. And it's all really shocking when all of this comes out at the end. It's all coming out in a kind of interrogation fashion. And we actually think perhaps this second version of the truth is far more believable. And we, as we get to the end of the book, we rather think, sadly, this is probably the case, that poor old Pi actually witnessed his mother being murdered by a hideous, evil chef, and that he has no recourse but to then murder the chef himself and try to eat him and his liver. So the two versions of the story live together in your head. You have, on the one hand, the tiger and the orangutan. On the other hand, you have his mother and the evil chef. And we don't know which one is right. The ending, at the very, very ending, implies actually that it could be the tiger and the orangutan that's the real story. That's the one that the Japanese journalists choose to believe, or so it seems in their article that they publish. But we skeptics might tend to think that sadly the tale of cannibalism was the one that was actually the true version. So this is a book that you can read and reread many, many times and still be undecided about your true feelings about the ending. And that's frankly what makes it such a great book. Another one on slightly similar lines of which version of an ending to believe in a way is The Magus by John Fowles, which is an epic read, one that many people return to again and again because of that very fact that it's enigmatic and you don't know really what the ending is, or even frequently what's going on during the book, because it's again very philosophical and very interesting and full of tricks and tricksters. So it's a postmodern novel about a man called Nicholas who goes to a Greek island to become a teacher, and he falls in love with a girl called Annabelle, I do believe. And he also meets a rather fascinating older man who's a teacher, who he gets completely sucked into this older man teacher's life and world. And he finds this man who's the teacher strangely powerful and fascinating. And we gradually realized that the man that he is fascinated by has many dark secrets in his life and was possibly a Nazi sympathizer, among other things. And Nicholas gets slowly sucked into this strange and unpredictable world. And the guy that he's slightly obsessed with is someone we slowly realize is quite difficult to take on face value. So it's a story which I'm not going to go into depth because it's a big old book and it is a classic, but it ends on this very ambiguous note when we don't know whether Nicholas and his love are going to get back together or not. And a lot seems to hinge, in people's opinions on the book, on the very last two lines, which are in Latin. And people translate these two lines differently, which is partly what makes it a really interesting and ambiguous ending, because it all hinges on the translation from the Latin. So, just to give you the Latin, it is cras amet qui numquam amavit, quique amavit cras amet. Now, I'm not a Latin scholar, but I did study Latin many years ago. And a possible translation of this Latin is, tomorrow let him love who never yet loved, and may whoever has loved love again tomorrow. Now, that could imply that the people that have loved will love again tomorrow. So they're going to get back together again. And John Fowles did actually say people should take the Latin quotation at the ending of the book more seriously than they have, because therein lies the clue to the ending. But there is another possible translation, which is, tomorrow shall be love for the loveless, and for the lover tomorrow shall be love, which is also quite confusing, let's face it, and not very clear. There's yet another option. May he love tomorrow who has never loved before, and may he who has loved love tomorrow as well. But I would say that's a pretty positive vibe in terms of the future and the love. And people do debate this at great length and wonder who is going to um, get together in the end. Are they going to get together in the end? Will there be a happy ending? So that's John Fowles' The Magus. I wonder if any of you have read it and if you love it. And if you haven't read it, you must, because it's another of those brilliant books that everyone should read, and which does have a profoundly ambiguous ending, which makes it all the more memorable. So I'm talking about a few different types of endings of books. We've had the ambiguous ending, and now I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of happy endings, because some people do love a happy ending, including me, though I also love different kinds of endings too. But a couple of happy endings with elements of slight mysteriousness as well are Rk Narian's The Guide and The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. So I'm just seeing Lisa's comment that you read The Magus as a teenager, but need a reread. It's definitely one of those books to reread, I think, every 10 years probably, because you're always going to see different things in it and get different things out of it every time you reread it. And it's also a great idea to reread in terms of revisiting your earlier self, because when you reread a book that you read as a teenager, you get to revisit your teenage self, which is a really great experience as a reader, because you think, oh, did I actually think that when I read it last time when I was only 17 or 16? I now feel completely differently about it because I'm now an adult who's having a very different experience of the book. So that's a great reason to reread books. Anyway, going back to happy endings, Rk Narian's The Guide is a book that I really love. Unfortunately, can't show you because I've only got it on Kindle, but it's a classic. I think it was written in the 1980s by the wonderful Rk Narian, who has written many books all set in his native southern India. And he actually invented a place called Malgudi in India, which is a fictional area, a bit like Thomas Hardy invented Wessex, which is kind of fictionally Wiltshire. But Malgudi is obviously based on real parts of southern India. And the guide by Rk Narian is about uh, a railway guide whose name is Railway Raju, because he starts off as a tourist guide and he's a sort of happy-go-lucky, quite risk-taking, feckless young man. And not to give you the whole story, but to briefly summarize, he falls in love with a dancer who's beautiful and he adores, and he becomes her manager. Then he marries her, but things go wrong and he ends up in prison. And he's in prison for a few years for having done some naughty things with money. And while he's in prison, he rethinks his ways. Spoiler alert, spoilers coming. Even with this spoiler, I think you would still really enjoy the book. So if you haven't read it, I'd say definitely still read it. So when he comes out of prison, he doesn't know what he's going to do. And he's been there for a few years. He's had a pretty amazing and exciting life doing lots of different jobs. And he wanders off to this temple where he sits down in a kind of lotus position. And he stays there for a couple of days, sitting there wondering what to do. And then someone comes up to him and asks him a profound spiritual question. And he sort of sits there nonplussed, thinking, ooh, why are they talking to me? And he just gives his honest answer. But slowly people begin to see him as a guide, a spiritual guide. So he starts off as a railway guide, and then he slowly becomes a spiritual guide without meaning to at all. So he sits there at the temple, people bring him food. He realizes that he's onto a good thing, being a different kind of guide, and that people respect him, look up to him, and listen to his words, even though he's just giving them his common sense words. And slowly he gets more and more sucked into this world of um, Louisa, great to see you. Lovely to have you joining me this evening. I'm talking about happy endings, and tonight, this moment, I'm talking about The Guide by Rk Narian, which is one of my favourite books and one of my favourite endings. So he's sitting in this temple, having accidentally become a spiritual kind of guide, and everyone is coming and asking him all these questions, and he's giving his rather Forrest Gump style answers, which they take very seriously. But as the weeks and months go on, there's a drought going on in the area where they're all living, and people begin to come to this new guide to try and help them bring rain to the dying country, because everything is dying around them. And this poor railway Raju, who's become the spiritual guide without meaning to, realizes that this is perhaps his moment to do something amazing, and he has begun to believe in himself as a spiritual guide. So he undertakes the idea that he will actually go on hunger strike until the rain comes. And he says to all the people that have begun to believe in him, if I sit here for days on end not eating, the rain will eventually come. And this is where the fabulous ending comes. So spoiler alert, if anyone doesn't want to know the ending, don't listen for the next minute. Raju is sitting there waiting for the rain to come, and sadly I can't read you the section, but it's a really beautiful moment when Raju feels the water coming up inside him, and he's standing there waiting for the rain, and he can literally feel the power of some bigger being than him, which is creating the water that's about to come out of the sky and save this area of India where everyone is dying from drought. And it's a very beautiful moment in the book, and it's pretty much the end of the novel. And we don't know, it is ambiguous, whether Raju survives that profound mystical moment or whether he actually dies in that moment. It's left ambiguous, but it's a very, really beautiful, wonderful, spiritual ending, which is a happy ending, which I absolutely love, which comes at the end of a very thought-provoking and rather spiritual novel. So that's The Guide by Rk Narian. Another book with a surprise happy ending, which I recently read and loved, is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, which is a book which I have spoken about here recently when I talked about aviatrixes in literature. And if anyone wants to watch that episode, it's on my YouTube channel. That's Aviatrixes in Literature, and it's a really fun one where I got to dress up as a female pilot and fulfill my fantasy, which I still want to actually go up into the sky and do. But this book, Great Circle, is all about a fictional pilot called Marion Graves, who goes on in 1950. She takes off around the world to complete the Great Circle around the world. Louisa's saying it's so good. Thank you. Isn't it fantastic? And just to warn people, I am going to talk about the ending. So if you haven't read this tome yet, I am going to make a revelation about the ending. So do not listen if you don't want the spoiler. But this is such a fabulous read, and you get completely sucked into Marion's life. It's based loosely on some real aviatrixes, and it's also quite heavily referring to what happened with Amelia Earhart, who actually did disappear. So in this novel, our heroine, Marion, disappears when she goes off on this trip around the world, and she goes off with her pilot. It's all incredibly dramatic and exciting, and lots of things go wrong on the way, but then they do eventually disappear, and we completely believe that she's died. And this is where the spoiler comes in, because the whole book is based on that total premise that she has indeed died. And we have a kind of time slip scenario with the novel, because we see her life, we get to know her brother incredibly well, we also get to know her lover Caleb, and her really dubious husband, who is a kind of petty criminal, well, a very successful kind of criminal who's made a lot of money out of selling alcohol in the age of when that wasn't allowed. And we've got all this massive backstory. And then we also have the really fascinating story of actress Hayley, who is going to act as Marion 20 years later in the 1960s. And she's looking back on the aviatrix and trying to find out about her story. So we have the 1960s versus the 1940s going on through the book, and it's all really gripping and exciting. And then there's this fantastic ending, which I'm now going to reveal. And I love it because it's an unexpected, happy ending. And I just want to read you a little bit of it, if I can find the relevant page. Because the ending, although it's dramatic and exciting and a revelation, it actually comes in in about 20 pages. So I'm not going to read you the whole thing because it would take too long, but I will read you a little bit. The man who opens the door to the hut on Campbell Island is called Harold, And he is, as he would say, being a practitioner of understatement, a bit surprised to find a sodden, semi-conscious woman at his feet. She is mumbling, jabbering. At best, he can make out she's begging him not to tell anyone she's there. But who are you? He asks, heaving her to her feet, bringing her inside. By then, she is past being able to respond. So she's very, very famous in her life because she's going around the world. Everyone knows that she's traveling around the world with her pilot. And she realizes when she washes up on this shore that she doesn't want to be discovered. She wants to be presumed dead. There's another man on the island, John, and a border collie called Swift. The hut and a few small outbuildings had been constructed during the war to house coast watchers, stationed there to alert the mainland if they saw enemy ships. They never did, but their meteorological observations proved so useful that after the war, the station was kept going. A year-long posting for a certain kind of man. A deliberate, meticulous kind of man who needed little society, who was content to perform the same tasks every day, take the same measurements, record the same data, translate that data to Morse code, and send it to some unseen recipient for use by people he will never meet, would prefer not to meet. It is one of the most significant waypoints of Marian's life that Harold and John are two such men. So Marian is lucky enough to wash up on an island where there's two men who really don't want to talk to anyone else. And she slowly recovers from her ordeal and ends up living in New Zealand. And joyously, she's in her 40s when that happens. She reaches her 70s and she still sees the love of her life, Caleb. So total spoilers there. Hope anyone that's in the middle of the book wasn't listening to that bit. But I just loved that surprise ending. I thought it was fantastic. And that's a happy ending, which was just joyous because it was very unexpected. And you've lived through the whole book thinking that she never made it. And it seems logical. We also know about Amelia Earhart, who it seemed to be very much based on, even though there's also the fantastic book I Was Amelia Earhart, which also implies that she lived happily on a desert island after she had supposedly died. So obviously these aviatrixes who disappear are living on in our imaginations. But that's one of my favourite happy endings of recent times. I'd love to share with you a couple of sinister endings. Now, I don't know if any of you have read The Debt to Pleasure by John Lancaster. This is a fabulously sinister book, and I do think that even when you know the ending, which I'm about to reveal, it's still an amazingly brilliant book to read. It does actually feel very strange giving away all these spoilers. So, because I never normally do give spoilers to people that I'm talking to about books, because I think it's really great to go into a book without having any expectations or knowledge of the end. So it's totally going against the grain to be giving away the endings. But because I'm talking about endings of novels tonight, I kind of have to do it. So again, if you don't want to hear it, then don't listen. But this is a book about a fabulously sinister, brilliant, highly refined and sophisticated man called Tarquin, who, through a series of anecdotes and recipes, slowly reveals his incredibly sinister nature. And I'm not going to tell you everything about it because I want you to read the book and to enjoy it. But it has been described as a skillful and wickedly funny account of the life of a loquacious Englishman named Tarquin Winnow, revealed through his thoughts on cuisine as he undertakes a mysterious journey around France. The revelations become more and more shocking as the truth about the narrator becomes apparent, which it very much does. And I just love the final chapter of this book when Tarquin is creating an omelette using some locally sourced mushrooms which he has found, and he's slowly revealed that he's an absolute aesthete who knows all about food and wine, and that he's incredibly knowledgeable about mushrooms. And I think you'll know where the book is going when I read you this paragraph. The most famous victim of the death cap was the Emperor Claudius. He succumbed to a dish of what he thought was Amanita caesura, Caesar's mushroom, a particularly scrumptious member of the otherwise highly dangerous Amanita clan. Another first-rate joke on nature's part, the shy beauty in a family of hoodlums. But Claudius's Amanita had been spiked, almost certainly by his wife Agrippina, with an admixture of its fatal cousin, a member of his family poisoning him with a member of the family of what he thought he was eating. He fell into a coma but vomited up the entire contents of his overloaded stomach and was then poisoned a second time, writes Suetonius, who betrays a forgivable lack of familiarity with the symptoms of death cap poisoning. Actually, the onset of aphalloidus poisoning is almost always followed by a lull and by apparent recovery. Victims are discharged from hospital. Sorry, I've just lost that. Given a clean bill of health and sent home, and then die several days later. The typical sequence is an intense period of vomiting, diarrhea, and stomach cramps, accompanied by other symptoms such as pronounced anxiety, swearing, and bodily tremors, commencing between 6 and 8 hours after the ingestion of the fungi and lasting for anything up to 48 hours. By the time these symptoms have commenced, the greater parts of the tissue damage inflicted by aphalloidus has already been done. So that's very near the end of the book. And then I'm just going to read you the very, very end of the book because it's really marvellous. And when you come to it, it really is highly satisfying, even though it is awful. And I do think Jan Lancaster is very, very clever. And I love all the books I've read by him, but this one is the most enjoyably sinister. And I won't give you all the details of what's going on in the plot because I really want you to read the actual book, but this will give you a really great flavour of what happens at the end. My parting with Laura and Huel did not scale/plumb the same heights/depths, but was more Englishly unsatisfactory. Huel loaded the bags into the back of the tinny hired Fiat, while Laura and I stood in front of each other, as if we were formally inviting each other to dance, to touch or not to touch. Huel came round and blokishly shook my hand, his grip predictably over-emphatic, before tactfully retreating and levering himself into the passenger's seat. Laura and I moved towards each other, and at the same movement, with the same combination of deliberation yielding to over-haste, so that our noses just avoided brushing, we exchanged a kiss, the innermost section of which was just involved each other's lips. Hers were unexpectedly dry. "Thank you so very much," she said. "Don't thank me." And then she was in the car, busily adjusting the seat and the mirror before strapping herself in one crisp movement. She started the engine and wound down the window. "Thanks again." I said nothing, but merely raised my hand in a benediction and wave, and kept it there as she tidily reversed the car seat out of the gate, before heading off down the lane towards the village, her husband with his head bent in some nausea-inducing feat of map consultation. I stood by the gate with my hands still aloft and watched them go down the track, a smoking contrail of grit rising in their wake. In a moment, they would pass the projected and hotly controversial location for the new municipal dump. Do you know the feeling when you've eaten half a biscuit and put the rest down somewhere, and now you can't remember where, so that you're left with a sense of incompleteness, of unfinished business, of an itch you can't scratch? And then there's the other feeling when you've done something unclean, something polluting or excremental with your hands, and you haven't had time to wash them yet, and you have to think back hard, and even so, you still can't quite remember what happened to make you feel besmirched, and the only certainty you have now is something to do with a lingering taint. I turned and walked back up to the house. By the time I got there, the murdered couple had gone around the corner onto the main road, leaving behind them a slow cloud of settling dust. So that was The Debt to Pleasure by John Lancaster, the last couple of paragraphs. And I'll leave it to you to find out what was actually happening. But it's a really fabulously grim and kind of expected, kind of unexpected ending. So another brilliantly grim ending, which is also utterly expected and utterly not expected, is in Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi, which is utterly brilliantly plotted and based on the play Antigone, from the ancient Greek. And you don't need to know the play in order to love the book, but it might help if you were to read a synopsis of it first, in a way, because it's really interesting and satisfying to see the way that Camilla Shamsi retells this story in a modern context. Isn't it amazing, Louisa? One of my favourite recent reads as well, even though it was published a few years ago. But it's one to keep going back to again and again. I think it might have been published in 2018, but very much read, everyone, if you haven't read it. So just to give you a little bit of a synopsis for people that don't know the book, it's Camilla Shamsi's seventh novel, reimagining Sophocles' play Antigone, which unfolds among British Muslims. The novel follows the Pasha family, twin siblings, Anika and Parvez, and their older sister, Ishma, who's raised them in the years since the death of their mother. So I won't give you all too much of the detail about it, but there are a few key facts which are really important. So Parvez, so the twins are Anika and Parvez, and Parvez attempts to follow in his father's footsteps by joining ISIS in Syria. He soon decides he's made a serious mistake, and his twin sister attempts to help him return to Britain, in part through her romantic relationship with Eamon Lone, who's the son of the British Home Secretary Karamat Lone, who's built his political career on his rejection of his own Muslim background. So there's so much amazingly fabulous and brilliant political commentary and satire going on in this book. It's really a book to keep going back to and to enjoy looking at that London modern context. The effort to bring Parvez home fails when he is shot and dies trying to escape ISIS. Sorry again, people, about the spoilers here. But if you don't want spoilers, basically, this is not the session for you because it's all about endings. Anyway, then Anika tries to return Parvez's body to the UK over the objections of Karamat Lone. And this is where the ending becomes utterly brilliant, horribly, in a way, artistically perfect, and absolutely true to the spirit of the play Antigone by Sophocles. You can see this Greek tragedy unfolding before you and turning into something horrifically plausible in this modern resetting of the drama. But it is absolutely brilliant, and the ending is also beautiful in its brutality and tragedy. So I'm going to read you this last moment of the book. Just wondering where to start the ending, because Calamat, who is the mayor of London, is watching from his house on TV. And I'll just read you that little bit to get into the mood. There was a hammering on the door. Suarez all clear code, and then his voice saying it was safe to come out. Karamat stood up so fast he felt a moment of lightheadedness. He turned the lock, heard all the bolts slide out from their positions of protection, heard his daughter burst into tears of relief, and turned to help her up. Terry doing the same, the three of them clinging together for a moment. When they pulled apart, there was Suarez, smiling in relief. Just some kind of hoax, sir. Useful drill for all of us. How do you know? Because they claim they've got you, sir, and clearly they haven't. The crackle of a walkie-talkie, a voice on the other end, urgent, horrified. Every television channel replayed it endlessly. A man in a navy blue shirt walks into the park. He is recognized. The journalists race forward. He holds up his hand to them, calls out the name of the woman he's come for. The cameras turn to her. She's the only person unaware, her cheek resting on the lid of ice that has melted to near transparency. And by the way, that lid of ice is where her brother has been contained in ice. She's been trying to keep him frozen, his dead body, so that she can bring him back to the UK. The journalists move back, allow a path from him to her. Onto this path step two men in beige shalwar chemises. At last you're here, says one, and opens his arms wide. The man in the navy blue shirt looks over to the woman, but he's in a new place. He doesn't want to offend. He allows himself to be embraced. While one man pulls him against his chest, pinning his arms in place, the other encircles his waist. The two men step away, turn, run. They are climbing the railings out of the park before the man in the navy blue shirt understands the belt they've locked around him. He tugs at it. He yells for a knife, something, anything to cut it off. But everyone is running towards this exit or that, screams and voices raised to God. Who else can save them now? One cameraman, a veteran of carnage, stops at the edge of the park, beyond the blast radius as best as he can judge, turns his lens onto the new emptiness of the field. The woman has stood up now. The man with the explosives around his waist holds up both his hands to stop her from coming to him. Run, he shouts. Get away from me, run! And run she does, crashing right into him, a judder of the camera as the man, holding it on his shoulder, flinches in expectation of a blast. At first the man in the navy shirt struggles, but her arms are around him. She whispers something, and he stops. She rests her cheek against his. He drops his head to kiss her shoulder. For a moment, they are two lovers in a park, under an ancient tree, sun-dappled, beautiful, and at peace. That is the utterly brilliant ending of Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi, which, if you haven't read it, you absolutely must. It's a really brilliant novel, and even though you've heard that ending, you're still going to be amazed and awestruck and impressed by the way that Camilla Shamsi retells that Greek tragedy and puts it into a modern context, taking us to Pakistan. So I've talked about Life of Pi, I've talked about enigmatic endings, talked about happy endings. I wanted to mention another satisfying ending, which is Tim Winton's The Shepherd's Hut, which is a coming-of-age novel in which the boy called Jaxie, is he called Jaxie? Yes, he is called Jaxie with an X. Jaxie Clacton comes of age in a rather brutal and shocking way. It's another book which is actually quite violent, I must admit. It does have some commonalities with Camilla Shamsi in that it does have a really brutal scene quite near the end, which is very unexpected and I won't go into. But it's a book which is full of swearing and outrageous, shocking expletives. I actually did it as my book group with my octogenarian book group. If any of you are watching tonight from Danny House, it was a really fun and great book group, but I think they were all quite shocked and horrified by the sheer number of fucks in this book. There's practically one on every line, and it makes it quite a hilarious read at times because it's all told in the voice of this 15-year-old Jaxie who's had a really hideous upbringing with his dad, and he runs away at the very beginning of the book, having just witnessed the death of his father. And he then goes into the desert near Perth and finds this shepherd's hut where he ends up living with a man of mysterious origin who we slowly realise was a very religious man. And this is another book which I actually love the ending because it has a sense of promise and hope, even though we've gone through utter horror. So it's a different kind of ending to the Camilla Shamsi, which ends in poetic and rather perfect artistic beauty, matching the Greek tragedy that it was based on. This one goes through quite a lot of horror and grimness, but actually comes out with Jaxie, the hero, going towards the future with hope and positivity. And he's a really lovable hero, even though he is utterly foul-mouthed and quite uncouth for much of the novel. But we grow to love him, we grow to appreciate him as the book goes on. And I'm just going to read you this very last paragraph, which I think will give you a bit of a flavour of the brilliance of the book. I buried him on the lake in the salt. It seemed right. The others, they went in the mining business. I never touched the weed. It wasn't worth the grief. Sorry about my non-Australian accent, but you wouldn't enjoy it if I did it. But I did borrow the Jeep. And because of all the Jerrys in that horse float, I've got enough petrol to get to Magnet and Broome and Darwin without having to stop. I've got almost everything I need. Food, cash, a few books to remind me of Finton. The rifle's gone, of course, but there's a shotgun on the back seat and a box of shells on the floor right here next to me. My phone's charged up now, no signal yet, but I got to see her face at last. I'll be in Magnet by noon, but I won't call till I'm just outside town. I'll take it slow with Lee. It'll all come pretty sudden, me showing up out of the blue, so I'll have to be patient. But I can afford to be, because I know what I am now, and peace is on its way. It fucking better be. So that's the lovable hero, Jaxie of The Shepherd's Hut, which is a brilliant read. And I would also suggest maybe listening to it on audio, because then you get the fantastic Australian accent, which really brings it to life. So one more on a similar lines before we stop. It's another coming of age novel, The Knife of Never Letting Go, but this one is actually a young adult novel, whereas the Tim Winton Shepherd's Heart is not a young adult novel by any means. I would call it a pretty grown-up novel, though I'm sure teenagers will probably love it too. But The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness is a fabulous coming of age YA novel, but also great for adults to read. And I thought about talking about this tonight because it's one of those books which ends on a cliffhanger. You want to know what is going to happen next, and therefore you have to read the next book in the trilogy, and which is The Ask and the Answer. And all of these books are fabulous, and I would utterly, strongly recommend them. I love the voice of the hero, Todd, who is another very lovable rogue. And one of the exciting things about this book is that in the world that Todd lives in, everyone can hear each other think. They can hear the noise of each other's thoughts. They can hear other men's thoughts, and they can also hear other animals and creatures' thoughts. So Todd can commune with his dog Manchi, and Manchi is one of the best and most beautiful canines in the world of literature. So it's worth reading for that, as well as for the fact that it's a really gripping and brilliantly written novel, and the whole trilogy I would say, is really very much about war, why wars happen, why people hate each other, why people don't like migrants, why migration is a highly complex business. And in this case, it's about people moving on to different planets and bringing their diseases to the indigenous people who are called the spackle, who are gradually dying out. And it's really fantastic. You empathize completely with the spackle. You also understand the migrating people, but then there are also the evil characters, such as Prentice, who is a really awful, brilliantly awful character. And I'll just read you a tiny bit of it, the very last few lines, which, if you've read the whole book, you'll realise are making you completely want to move on to the next book, and the very next chapter. So I'll just read you the last little bit. I look back at Mayor Prentice. Oh, it's President Prentice now, he says. You'll do well to remember that. And then I realise I can't hear his noise. The noise is the noise of people's thoughts, by the way, they call it the noise. I can't hear anyone's. No, he says, I imagine you can't, though that's an interesting story and not what you might. Viola slips a little more from my hands, the shift of it making her give a pained gasp. Viola is the love interest and other main character of the book, apart from Todd. Please, I say, save her. I'll do anything you say. I'll join the army. I'll... All good things come to those who wait, the mayor says, finally looking a little annoyed. He dismounts in one easy movement and starts taking off his gloves one finger at a time. And I know we've lost. Everything is lost. Everything is over. As the newly appointed president of this fair planet of ours, the mayor says, holding out his hand, as if to show me the world for the first time, let me be the very first to welcome you to the new capital city. Todd, Viola whispers, her eyes closed. I hold her tightly to me. I'm sorry, I whisper to her. I'm so sorry. We've run right into a trap. We've run right off to the end of the world. Welcome, says the mayor, to New Prentice Town. And this is the kind of book, end of book one, that takes you straight into the next book and the next chapter of the next book to get you going. So that's a trilogy. That's another kind of ending where there's a cliffhanger and it makes you want to move on to the next one. I haven't even talked about The Great Gatsby, which is clearly the most famous, one of the most famous last lines in literature, but I'll save that for another day. This is definitely not the last word on last lines in novels. I'm sure that lots of you watching will have your own thoughts about what makes a brilliant ending of the book. But I'd love to know, if you get a chance to send me a message, do you love your books to end on a happy note where everything gets tied up? Do you like your books to end with enigma and mystery, which I know Cyber Flaneurs, who's here tonight, would enjoy and said that's what she prefers? Do you like them enigmatic and more true to real life? Or do you like them with a bit of a brutal twist at the end, like we had with the John Lancaster? A lot of crime novels end with justice being meted out to the baddies, which is another way to go that we haven't talked about. And then, of course, there's the love stories when people get their happy endings, such as in Jane Austen's novels and Bridget Jones's Diary. So thanks so much for joining me tonight. Do let me know your thoughts on endings of novels. How do you like them to end? Next week, I'm going to do great houses in literature. And then I'm going to be doing lighthouses in literature, which will be at the end of February, 23rd of February, on Damien Barr's Literary Salon, Facebook and Instagram. So I look forward to seeing you then. And I'll see you next week for Great Houses in Literature. I wonder if you've got any particular houses that come to mind, let me know. Send me a message, send me a tweet, send me a message on Instagram, send me an email if you have any thoughts about any of those topics. And thanks for coming. Have a lovely night. See you soon. Whoop.